Okay, so welcome also from me. My name's Prajnamanas and I'll give the talk. If you haven't been to Dharma Night before, we always do it roughly like we're doing it now. Meditation in the first half, and on the second half a talk, usually with a chance for questions and a bit of discussion in the second half. And we're usually working our way through a theme or a set of texts or teachings, and usually those are taken from books and lectures by our teacher Sangharakshita, so based whether closely or loosely on courses of material he thought it was important for people getting involved in Buddhism to know about. So tonight we start a series called What is the Sangha? And I'm going to give a kind of introduction to the Sangha. Specifically the Sangha as a jewel. I'll say more about why it's known as that. But first wants to say I'm really excited to have the opportunity to speak on this, because what I'm going to try and do this evening is clarify what makes Buddhism distinct, if you see what I mean. Why is it its own tradition? What is Buddhism saying that other traditions aren't? Partly that appeals to me because if we're a bit woolly on the idea, you can incorporate it into almost any other set of ideas, if you see what I mean. Like saying, if it teaches kindness, maybe essentially it's the same as Christianity, or if it's about a sort of mystical union with a dimension beyond the one we can immediately see, maybe it's the same as Hinduism. If it values the rational faculty and reflection and being in touch with your immediate experience, maybe it's very humanistic and just a kind of old kind of humanism, if you see what I mean. You can sort of go round the clock of all those things and be back where you started, and probably not much further along understanding what makes a Buddhist, if you see what I mean. Why it's that they're practicing. And as you can probably guess, I don't personally agree with any of those statements I was mocking up there about other traditions. So the Sangha Jewel, that's the title of my talk. Sorry, I don't know if it was the title on the YouTube thumbnail or not, but that's what I've scribbled here, the Sangha Jewel. So Buddhism calls the highest values the Three Jewels. There's loads and loads of values that could be cultivated, aren't there? Loads of things that are valued, and if you like, we value things whether we know it or not. So that's happening, if you see what I mean. If we put an immense amount of thought and energy into our career, that simply means we value career, if you see what I mean, and so on and so on. So it's probably quite obvious, if we spend our days reading car magazines, we must value cars and thinking about cars. So the word value, while it's got a kind of, it's not a word you come across every day necessarily, what do I value, what is a higher value, but as I say, I think really we're valuing things or not valuing them all the time. And I think often, let's say even among lots of different spiritual traditions like the ones I was mentioning, or to most of the people we meet, if you name a broad value, we'd agree that it is one, if you see what I mean, like love, or kindness, or generosity, if you see what I mean. Those must be values. I suppose maybe some people don't value them, and maybe people have worldviews they've developed in which they wouldn't prioritise those by saying, for example, if you're generous, someone will just take advantage of you, if you see what I mean, in which case generosity is not valued. But most of the time, I think most of us would agree that those things are values. And I'd even say further that you can probably start to put them in a hierarchy. if you see what I mean. You can start stacking them by importance. So we might value intelligence, so just think that's a good thing for a person to have. Parents usually want their children to have good enough schooling that they can develop it, and so on. On the other hand, intelligence could be used well or not, if you see what I mean. I probably don't need to name examples, but really it's only a faculty. Does that make sense? You could put it to an evil use or a very generous one. If I said love, it's probably getting clearer that we're mentioning something that is good, if you see what I mean. I think pretty much all of us want it. As Buddhists, we also want to give it, we want to cultivate it, and so on. What Buddhism is saying is that the highest values are the three jewels, and those are the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. It's saying that those three things encompass or express everything that has worth in their highest form. Okay? So when, in a way, this is just a kind of, I'm defining my terms here, if you sort of mean by way of introduction, that Buddhism, reveres the three jewels. We salute the three jewels at the beginning of the evening when we salute the shrine. Those words really are a salutation to these three values. Yes, and they're the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. So just very briefly, as a lot of you will know this, the Buddha is, several things, but mainly a historical human being who broke through into a realm of consciousness that's outside time that we call Enlightenment, which is basically a place from which you cannot backslide into pettiness or ill will or even distraction or even boredom, if you see what I mean. It's such a complete breakthrough into wisdom as to how things are and compassion for all that lives that for Buddhists it's the highest kind of consciousness. So we refer to that as the Buddha. I mean, in a way it's a person. In another way it's a principle. And the reason it's kind of idealised in golden sculptures with beautiful forms and so on is partly a metaphor for the mind that's become enlightened, is saying it's beautiful, well-formed, deeply aware, loving, and so on. Okay, so that's the Buddha. The Dharma is what he has penetrated to. So the truth of how things arise, for example, all phenomena. So while it's not a kind of omniscience as to, being able to guess different things that are happening in different parts of the world, if you see what I mean, it's a kind of complete seeing of how things arise. And for our purposes, especially suffering and lack of suffering. So that's the truth, the Dharma. But it's also the way of ascending to the mind of a Buddha. So it's what we practice as Buddhists, the Dharma. And the Sangha, again, has several meanings. One is all of those other beings that have become enlightened through contact with this teaching. But then at a much more day-to-day level, you've probably heard this definition as well, it's basically the community of people practicing all that stuff together, okay, practicing the Dharma together on the way to Buddhahood. So it's a sort of, you could see it as a pyramid, if you like. You've got this community who share this vision of the truth, which is an attempt to climb all the way to the enlightened mind. And known in the tradition as the Three Jewels. So there's a couple of ways to look at this. I mean, firstly, perhaps I'll just tell the story of the three of them arising, because they arose in a sequence. In a way, they didn't all come together at the same time. So the Buddha became the Buddha, this is probably clear, when he became enlightened. Okay, so when that man broke the last fetter, as it's called, of doubt as to his worthiness to be enlightened, or saw as deeply as he needed to into how sufferings and joy arise in other beings. When he'd seen that completely, he became the Buddha. So at first, you just had the Buddha, if you see what I mean. There was a time where you've got one person, even though he didn't think of himself as a person anymore exactly, who's had this breakthrough. Okay, and there's a wonderful story of him wondering whether or not to actually bother trying to communicate this to others, which hopefully I'll come back to. Anyway, when he did and found the 5 ascetics, as they're known, his former companions who'd practiced austerities together and nearly starved themselves and all sorts of things to try to sort of subjugate their bodies to their minds, and it hadn't worked. Anyway, when he went and found them, told them his realization and started to communicate it, you could say that the Dharma jewel was born. So as soon as somebody else got that, or as soon as it was spoken, what he'd realized to another receptive mind, well, another way of putting it is that the wheel of Dharma was set in motion. You sometimes see a Buddha cradling a sort of wheel like this. And you could say that it rolled, I mean, it stays in his hands in the image, but I was wondering why it's a wheel. There's probably various reasons, but it rolled from him to others at that moment. So it I don't know if it crossed a gap, but let's say it crossed a gap from his mind into other minds. He spoke it out. Okay. So that's why communication of the qualities of his mind are known as the Dharma. And the Sangha was born very shortly afterwards, when those 5 followers, I've given the game away, those 5 students said to him, accept me as your follower. Okay? So this is a slightly subtler shift, if you see what I mean. You've got the Enlightenment. I was going to say it's a historic breakthrough, but it's more than historic, kind of mythic, cosmic breakthrough of what's outside time intersecting with the human realm, incredibly. Then you've got communication of that, that's the Dharma. What you've then got is a decision in the minds of people hearing that, yes, I do want to go towards this, and yes, you are the person to guide me on that path. So they say, please accept me as your follower. At a lot of these moments in the scriptures, different heavens resound with the importance of it, and the earth shakes. So crucial are these in the sort of, not just human history, like I say, but the intersection of the human and the mythical. Okay, so what I'm going to try and look at, now that I've described all 3 jewels, is why they're equally important for us, why they should remain united or are actually facets of the same thing, and then why the Sangha in particular is important. Because you could say, if the Sangha is just people practicing Buddhism, that could just be a nice group of people. If you see what I mean, if you've got the enlightened mind as your aim, and we think that's a worthy thing, we even revere it, make offerings to the Buddha, have a sort of a strong yes from inside us to go towards it. We know we need a path to get to it. But why do we need a Sangha? Maybe I'll ask you, actually. Why do we need fellowship between practitioners? Why be connected? Let's say you could just look up texts on the internet, learn how to meditate on your own, read some Buddhist books, and presumably develop.
To support each other on the path.
To support each other on the path, okay.
Mm.
Yeah. And can you say even a little bit more, why might that help? With let's say the first 2 jewels, why might that support?
Support each other, I guess, because it's not easy to kind of get the realization, because knowing the Buddha's path, we know that he worked very hard for that.
Yes.
And many years. So I guess it makes sense to stick with each other and help each other, and so
yes.
From that perspective.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah, sorry, a bit unfair maybe to draw you out, but but that's good, thank you, yeah. So we need the support of other people practicing because it's not easy. Yeah, to say the least. Not easy, yeah. Anyone else got any thoughts about Gail? Let's just go to Gail and then to you, if that's all right.
Interesting you're asking the question, because it feels very light for me at the moment. I think there's something about also being able to give each other kind feedback, like act as mirrors to each other on the path.
Okay, giving kind feedback and acting as mirrors, yeah. And can I ask you the same question? Why might that help us to grow?
Well, because I think we all have blind spots, and how can we... I think it's quite easy when we're not surrounded by friends in the Sangha to actually slowly derail from the path. I'm from experience.
Okay.
And derail from the path.
Yeah.
Without really noticing it, because we all have the blind spots. And then if you don't have kind friends around you to say, hey, my friend, come back a little bit.
Yes.
Then you
Not
realize
that way,
you
this
turn
way.
around and you're like, oh my God, the path is over there, and I'm all the way there.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. So because we have blind spots, we need well-aimed feedback to keep us on the path, it sounds like you're saying. So that's quite good to the first pair of responses there. So the words I might give there are both support and challenge being provided in that kind of quest that's expressed in the first two jewels. Yeah. And what were you going to add?
I think Sangha is important to me because I feel like it offers me a way to systematically know and learn Buddhism. It's a bit like, we came to this world, we don't know much, we learn things through our family, through school. It's kind of a similar thing that I kind of get a feeling of, what I get from Sangha is to learn or know things, explore things systematically.
Okay, to learn and explore things systematically. Yeah. And do you know how that happens via the Sangha as opposed to, for example, from Dharma books?
I think that's exactly that. You can, read a couple of books and have some ideas, but it's very hard for you to, it's very hard for me to sort of actually find a defined way that, year after year you will progress more. You can read more books, but you're not quite sure if you're on the right path or you're actually further than where you were a year ago. But whereas you're in, for example, in LBC, you will then be able to know that you sort of progress further year after year.
So perhaps that's a bit similar to Gail's point about being mirrored, what you're saying there about growth, how you know year on year that you're growing, for example. Yeah. But what you've also, sorry, I don't know your name actually.
It's Daniel.
Daniel, yeah. What you've also reminded me of there, Daniel, is that something like a Dharma book or even a Dharma talk will be quite general. Unless we're known individually, it will be quite hard to know what we next need. You said something about next steps, I think, or how to progress next. So I think that's another strength of the Sangha, and we're getting to the meat of it here, which is to do with individual relationships. So I'm riffing a little bit now on what you've said, but unless we actually, I would say, form individual relationships with other people practicing towards a common goal, it would be very difficult for us to know what the next step is. Partly what I'm hinting at here is that, and I know it's a bit cartoonish and you have all come to a Buddhist centre, so you're not all trying to sit at home alone with a Dharma book, but anyway, for the sake of the cartoon, say you did just read books or hear the Dharma from YouTube. Actually, I don't know why I'm talking about books, it's probably YouTube these days. We could, and perhaps this uses what Gail said as well, we could have a notion that we were progressing or think, oh, maybe this is where I go next. We wouldn't really know, would we? We'd be forming our own ideas, which are not reflected back to us or even visible in the world. And that would be the best we could do. But unless it's actually tested out in personal relationships, we could, will eventually delude ourselves, actually. It's a bit like the metta bhavana that we were doing in the first half. Unless we actually test the development of our metta within personal relationships, it might just be a pleasant or not so pleasant experience on the cushion. But I'd add something to that, which is that we probably need to test out our development and our growth in ways like metta with people who hold the same values. Partly it can be easier. Not sure. If others are encouraging the same qualities, they can pull us up on our shortcomings more sensitively, but also rejoice in our growth with a bit more awareness. Hopefully, I mean, it's never especially been like this for me. Some Buddhists say it is, but hopefully maybe your families, say, since you've been practicing Buddhism, have noted and rejoiced in how much more kind and friendly you've become. I'm still to get that. There's strong feedback from my own family, but that's okay. They're extremely good in many ways, and they don't have to rejoice in my growth. To be clear, just in case they're watching. You never know now that we're hybrid. But our growth on the path can be much more sensitively, subtly noticed or schooled and corrected in the way Gail was suggesting by other people who hold the same values. So there's a kind of spread or a sketch of why Sangha might be important. I'm going to kind of zoom out a little bit now and talk about how to live effectively as a Buddhist. We've touched on that already a bit. The Sangha is going to be one of the important conditions for how to make sure we're living an effective Buddhist life. But what Sangharakshita says in his introduction to this book, I don't know if I mentioned the book yet, but anyway, What is the Sangha is a collection of his lectures, now essays on the subject. What he says is that an effective Buddhist life is a committed Buddhist life, that there's not really any difference. What we want, of course, is for our practice to have an effect. With that's why we're doing it. He's saying, if you really want your practice to have effects, be committed. Just a really simple formula. Effective could even be a slightly technical term, so I like this emphasis. You know, you could, like I say, even decide yourself whether or not my practice is effective. It's sort of, it sounds kind of a bit too measurable to me. Anyway, he's saying an effective one is a committed one. And the way we commit in Buddhism is called going for refuge. Okay, so I'll just unpack that a little bit now. Refuge sounds a little bit like hiding. What it's really saying, this phrase, which we also chant quite often in our puja, is going for refuge to these three values. So it means not just recognising the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha as values, but saying in a wholehearted way we want to move towards them. Buddhists call that going for refuge. The reason it's using that language is it's saying security, real security, will not actually be provided by, for example, material things, like having more money, for example. Very, very, very tempting to think it is. Of course we need enough money. We've probably all at one time or another worried about money, or at least felt anxious about it, which is not quite the same thing, but anyway, we all know what that's like, and of course we all have material needs. On the other hand, the mind can subtly start to go for refuge to security as provided by something like money. Quite often, actually, when people get more, they just have the same wish again. I think there have been studies to show, well, for example, that it's something like between 3 and 6 months from when you move into a property that you start wanting a property with just one more room. You see what I mean? which is actually probably what you were doing by moving into that property. So you basically start wanting to do it again between 3 and 6 months in. Amazing, isn't it? Considering how much work and effort that might take and how much of an aspiration it might be. So what the phrase going for refuge, which is very, very important in the tradition, is saying is that real refuge or real security will be found in these 3 utmost values in the end. If the Dharma is the truth, here's another example. If you're ever tempted to lie, you could tell yourself, because we're usually trying to protect ourselves with a lie, you see what I mean? From some sort of short-term pain, embarrassment, awkwardness, mainly. I mean, there's very, very pressurised situations where, I don't know, you could say it's more of an extreme case, but anyway, we won't run philosophical examples here. Let's just say in that ordinary temptation, which again I would venture that we've all felt, to lie, we're trying to protect ourselves from something. What going for refuge is saying is that the thing that will protect you really in the end is the truth. That will protect you the most. It doesn't mean it will protect you from embarrassment or awkwardness or pain or losing something that you want to hold on to. Maybe through telling the truth in a work situation, you'd actually lose some status or an opportunity or a pay rise, and by not sort of pushing or twisting at least the truth, do you see what I mean, to suit your own ends, maybe you'd actually lose a bit of material security by that. But these utmost values are challenging us to know that the real protection in the end would be from the truth. Okay? So that's why it's called going for refuge. It's a great shift. That's what it represents. Actually, we chant it every time we do a puja. When people become mitras, they chant the refuges and precepts. So they say, I want to go for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha. We might say it every morning before our meditation practice. And that starts to hint at the fact that it's not a one-time thing. Just because we've said it once doesn't mean we mean it really, really deeply. Just because we've said it every day for years doesn't mean we couldn't still mean it quite a lot more deeply, and that we need to deepen our practice of it all the time. But what we're chipping away at when we chant that, or when we have that wish to go for refuge, is 2 things that form this shift. One is a recognition that permanence, unchanging identity, real bliss and pure beauty are not going to be found in those mundane things that we've been talking about, if you see what I mean. And again, I think we'd all agree we want those things. Not just a bit of pleasant experience, but we probably want beauty, actually. We'd like our consciousness to become more and more refined, elevated, beautiful. So it won't be found in things like money or a house with 1 more room. And secondly, is the resolve to make the great transition from looking to those things for security to looking for it from the 3 jewels. So that's what we mean by going for refuge. And the reason I'm talking about this is when we chant those verses, we say, I go for refuge to the Buddha, I go for refuge to the Dharma, I go for refuge to the Sangha. When you put all that together, it's quite a lot of esoteric sounding language, which is why I'm kind of unpacking it into things like security, real security, and enlightenment, truth and fellowship, which you could call the 3 jewels. Yeah. Although it really means enlightenment, truth that leads you there, fellowship with people, acknowledging that's the truth and trying to get there, if you see what I mean. This resolve to make the transition is one of the great distinctions of Buddhism. So I said at the beginning, I'm excited to put what actually makes Buddhism different or distinct. The reason going for refuge is there at all is that we can become a Buddha, if you see what I mean. That is one, if anyone ever tries to argue to you that Christianity and Buddhism are basically the same, for example, you can say one of the chief differences, Auntie, is, or Uncle, that in Christianity you're not trying to become God, quite clearly. Maybe there's language in some quarters of trying to become one with God, but I'm not sure what the difference would be. That sounds rather like trying to become God. Anyway, I never heard it said in my Christian upbringing that you need to try to become God through your own efforts, wouldn't it? Say, come again? So that's not the case. In Buddhism, we are actually trying to grow all the way towards Buddhahood ourselves. Might sound very alien. That's probably because it's not exactly we ourselves that would become a Buddha. It's not this Prajnamanas with this mind, just a bit sort of bigger and shinier and nicer and better at giving talks, if you see what I mean, that would be the Buddha that I'm trying to become. It's quite unimaginable to me, actually, which is how to soften partly that sense that it's quite alien to us or unattainable or just really distant or really kind of ancient and foreign sounding, if you see what I mean. We are actually trying to realise Buddhahood in our own life. Apparently a great Indian Swami of the 20th century, Ram Das, was asked why so many people who've been following spiritual traditions for so many years fail to make any real progress. In other words, fail to actually grow towards their goal, even though they've been coming along to lots of positive things and doing their chanting and their meditation and their puja and turning up in all the right ways. And he gave a great answer. He said, there's two reasons people, if they do fail to make progress, there's two reasons they do. One is the lack of a clearly defined goal, and two, the lack of a clearly defined means for getting there. So I thought that was great. And to me, it explained a lot of the woolliness that I think we've got to try and clear away in that vague or universalistic talk about religion and religious traditions that I was pointing out at the beginning. And actually, what he's describing there is the Buddha and the Dharma for a Buddhist, the first two jewels. A clearly defined goal. So you could say, and it's easy for it to trip off the tongue, but just for the sake of argument, for clearly defining our goal, a mind thoroughly and completely imbued with wisdom and compassion. Easy. Okay, that's the Buddha, a mind like that. The Dharma, the way of getting there. So you could say, why is the third one also a jewel? Everybody acknowledges that these things are important, and actually, although lots of Buddhist traditions will chant the refuges to the Three Jewels, a lot of them won't emphasise Sangha nearly as much as we do in our movement and order. Or they'll use the definition that it's enlightened people in the world, wherever they may be in space or time. Enlightened disciples of the Buddha, for example. That's the Sangha. They're worthy of reverence because they've attained to the goal and so on. But you could say that that third jewel is demoted to a slightly less important place in the system. They're not exactly Buddhists, but I was remembering earlier one of the great examples of this in my mind. I don't know if you watched that, oh goodness, I've forgotten its name. The Netflix series about Osho's followers. Wild Wild Country, thank you. Okay. If you haven't seen it, I really recommend it. I don't know if it's still on Netflix or not. I don't often recommend TV programmes, but I thought it was a really excellent piece of TV. It's just 6 episodes, very, very good storytelling about this. I'm not sure they ever clearly defined themselves, actually. Sect of, at first it looked quasi-Hindu, quasi-Buddhist. Eventually they decided to renounce all religion and say they weren't any religion. Anyway, a very, very exciting, very attractive and appealing community of meditators and practitioners of some sort, started in India, then settled in the States. As this program unfolds, there's brilliant drama, but not sensationalist, told, I think, quite fairly, quite sensitively, about this community of people buying a plot of land in the desert. And of course, it all starts to tip slowly but steadily downhill. At one point, not only are they laying an airstrip and they've got planes, but they've got guns to protect themselves or each other. They're trying to sort of co-opt the local politics to get themselves into positions of power in order to try and get more land, change laws in their favour, so on. There's an attempted poisoning by a leading disciple, and it goes tumbling down. But there's two interesting things. One, I would say that it does look very inspiring what they're doing, at least at first, in episodes 1 and 2. Well, what I mean is, I could sympathise with a new way of life being made apparent. Okay, they all dress in a particular colour. They all look very close. They perform a ceremony to join. They've left behind career. They want to give not just their energy, but even their money to this thing that they're building together. They're basically trying to build a community. You could argue that really they fail. But they're trying to build a community. So that was the first thing I noticed is, to an extent, I do sympathise. Not with episode 3 onwards, but anyway, the co-opted politics and the rather uglier things that start to go on. The second was, I thought, that's not a Sangha. And that's part of the reason, to me, it fails. Unfortunately, these people, and I don't think I'm doing them any injustice, people in our movement and order know people who were at one time involved, or a friend of mine used to keep up with them and read their books a bit and so on. So they were trying to do something. But anyway, the documentary shows rather threatening behaviour from them, especially around the sort of perimeter of their site, towards the people in the local area. So as I was remembering it earlier, I thought, okay, there's one measure where you've broken what I would think of as Sangha, because you're putting a very sort of tight ring around that. Not only when they're walking around with guns, but they're perfectly prepared to do political battle with the people around them to try and gain advantage and more resources for themselves. So I thought, that's definitely not a Sangha. My readiest example, I'm afraid, is our own order and movement. There have been other Sanghas in history, but just to take the one that's to hand, I thought that would be very, very different to our centre, where we just really hope more and more people will come in the doors, if you see what I mean. I live and work here, as well as teaching here, and people have occasionally said to me over the years, don't you feel you're living in a bubble? And I know why they're asking, because I don't commute into town to work in an office. I work here, and so on. But I'm personally very confident that I'm not doing anything like that in a bubble, because, if you like, even if I've formally joined a spiritual community, I try to work at the very edge of that as much as I can. What I mean is by doing things like activities at a centre where we throw the doors open and meet people who are coming for the first time. So if I'm in contact every week with people who would definitely not yet call themselves Buddhists, and who might be just coming in for a look around and then go off again, it doesn't look to me like a bubble. Does that make sense? Really, I'm hoping it's very porous, very welcoming, easy to become involved with, easy to become uninvolved if that's what the person wants, and trying to work, if this is a nucleus for something, the Sangha, or our order particularly, trying to work right at the edges of itself to attract people into it if that's what they want, or just try to help alleviate suffering on its own level, which is why we've had projects other than centres as well, why we've got a charity shop down the road that's got very close connections with the local community and actually great success, it's been going for years, is working in the community, a team of Buddhists, but not propounding Buddhism and teaching meditation, just selling second-hand clothes. But to say what a Sangha really is, and again, what I think they didn't manage in that, I don't know which US state it was in, but it's one of those huge, expansive... Oregon. Huge, expansive, desert-looking places. Is that membership of a spiritual community or a Sangha doesn't mean just having a membership card or paying a subscription or even simply performing a ritual. It means personal relationships with the people in that community. So if I wasn't trying to develop friendships with people who come along to the centre, with other people in the order, for example, I would only, in the driest, most formal sense, be part of what I would call a Sangha. So now, that leads me on to one of the most important points I want to make, which is that a Sangha, in its truest sense, is actually not a group of people, I would say. In its loose usage, you say something like the LBC Sangha. Even that at the risk of doing something a bit insiderish, actually, because you could say that the LBC Sangha or its community is anybody in relationship to it right now. So anybody here, anybody listening, anybody considering coming along, they're potentially in this larger community. So yes, in the loose sense, you talk about something like the LBC Sangha. But I think in its real sense, it's to do with a spirit and a very living spirit of communication of those shared values between its members, that's when Sangha actually arises. So we'll go into this loads more in the series. Next week, I really, really recommend coming along. One of our best speakers, most long-standing teachers at the Centre, Jnana of Archer, is giving a talk on the true individual, which in our own teacher's vision of it is the thing that we're all trying to become, a true individual. And it's an association of those people that form a Sangha. So basically, I'm saying it's not a club. Even if we come along, and we can all slip into these ideas. We come along, we think we're basically part of it. That's great. That's probably very positive. For some time, that will probably just be a better thing to do in terms of the values it expresses than spend the evening at the pub, say. It will probably evoke a higher value. So that'll be a good thing. But what we're then trying to do is spark that spirit of aliveness between ourselves. And the way that that really happens is friendship. And to give it its full name, and a phrase that we use a little bit less often nowadays, spiritual friendship, which is a translation of a phrase used by the Buddha and his disciples, which was Kalyana Mitrata. Kalyana means beautiful, charming, helpful, auspicious, or morally good, and Mitrata means friendship or fellowship. So Bhante, our teacher, points out that Kalyana Mitrata, which we've slightly awkwardly translated as spiritual friendship, has aesthetic, moral, and religious connotations. So isn't that great? That in this definition of friendship, you've got beauty, you've got goodness, but you've also got something more true in this vision of what's called friendship. One of the most famous instances where this is raised up as an expression of the value of Sangha in the tradition is a story where the Buddha is sitting with his attendant, Ananda, who was his cousin and assisted him personally for a long, long time. And they've sat in silence for quite a while. And Ananda says, Master, it seems to me that Kalyana Mitrata, or spiritual friendship, is half of the spiritual life. Okay, so he's obviously been reflecting on that for some time. And the Buddha says, say not so, Ananda, say not so. It is the whole of the spiritual life. Okay? And you could say that the answer to why the Sangha is the third jewel, why it can't be lopped off and just left with a goal and the means for getting there, is in that answer. It doesn't exactly give us the answer. It's just the Buddha saying spiritual friendship is the whole of the spiritual life. In a way, that's for us to unpack, if you see what I mean. Sometimes it could sound as though Sangha is just a means, if you see what I mean. Like, it's good to have friends who are also practicing because it helps us, if you see what I mean. My practice benefits enormously from being friends with other Buddhists. I mean, I wouldn't have lasted a month without, I mean, that quite literally, actually. I was starting to meditate from a booklet, but without real individuals, flesh and blood individuals to actually relate to over this, I don't think it would have lasted longer than that. When I came to my second weekly drop-in class, the guy who'd led it the first week recognised me, said hello, and we had a little chat. So that sent me a message already that something was going on more than the meditation, if you see what I mean. In my own practice now, I cannot imagine having a meditation practice outside of the context of having a communication practice with other meditators. That sounds a bit formal. I don't think I have a communication practice, but you know what I mean. I'm in communication, quite lively communication, with lots of other meditators. It's wonderful. But I don't even really think anymore about my meditation practice as divorced from that. Does that make sense? But what that is ultimately evoking is spiritual friendship, not just as a means. So I said it can sound like a means, like it helps me in my practice. That's what I was exploring. So I heard someone once say, friendship is a means to wisdom. I thought, okay, that sounds good enough. Friends help us become wise in some of the ways we were mentioning, point things out, support along the path, and so on. But then I heard someone say, from the point of view of insight, you could also say wisdom is a means to friendship. And I thought, again, all it sort of gave me was another rather beautiful riddle, like the Buddha saying spiritual friendship is the whole of this Dharma life. But I think it sounded quite a lot more beautiful than saying friendship is a means to wisdom, saying wisdom is a means to friendship. Yes, let's just see where I want to go now. Okay, I've got a few other things I might say, but I've talked for quite a while, so let's just see what questions you might have about what I've been saying. We've got a little bit of time. Yes?
I'm going to apologise because I might not articulate this very well. My Buddhist knowledge is not super high, but hopefully you'll pick up the question that's hidden in my thinking out loud. So, sure. I guess the first part of the question is, where does the Sangha end and where does it start? And does it start or end? You know, if you extrapolate it out far enough, in the sense that you know everyone's maybe everyone's in the Sangha, but they just don't know it yet, right? But that could be wrong. I don't know. But the second part I was thinking about, especially as you're talking about Osho, which I've seen, and not to label it a cult because whatever, but you know, whether it's a cult or a very strict religious order or I think as humans we yearn for community, right?
Yes.
And maybe the difference between like a healthy community or an unhealthy one is does it try and propagate itself at the expense of the members?
Ah, okay. So does a real... I'm just going to jump in there for the sake of time.
So I think you get the thread of where
I do. Yeah. Thank you. So you were asking, does a community try to propagate itself at the expense of its members?
Which it seems like Osho did. Right?
Yes, yeah. Perhaps. Yeah. Your first question, where does it start and end? In a way, when I said it's not just... It could be people... The Sangha could be people here or even people thinking about coming. I'm slightly exaggerating for effect to try to get away from the literal sense that it is a club of people who've been initiated, basically, and to get us towards the idea that Sangha is a spirit of communication and a spirit of friendship that won't necessarily arise even in a fairly positive group of people, but you absolutely hope it does, and a positive group, a group sharing similar values, is the best basis on which it will arise.
Okay.
Yeah, and then you were asking, I'm just going to carry on because I think we've just got time for one other question when I've had a go at answering your second one. I wouldn't say at all that a true Sangha tries to propagate itself at the expense of its members, absolutely not. Actually, next week's talk I hope will go into this, because really what Sangha starts to chip away at is the idea that our own personal development and the good of those around us are not two things, if you see what I mean. So actually, if individuals are developing and in communication with other individuals, the community will be better and better, won't it? Part of having a movement and an order is a way of ensuring we've actually got the same language to talk about it. So, for example, because we do the mindfulness of breathing and the metta bhavana, anywhere you go in the true Ratna Buddhist community, you'll learn those practices. One of the reasons for that is that we feel they're very important for personal development. Another reason, or at least a huge advantage, is that anywhere you go in our community, which is in lots of different places in the world, you'll be able to talk to another Buddhist about your practice of mindfulness and metta based on exactly the same way of cultivating them. So as you develop personally in that way, so will you support others to do the same, because you'll be practicing awareness of them. So it cannot be, by definition, that by increasing my own awareness, it'll actually come at the cost of somebody else's, or at the cost of my kindness.
Yeah.
Since I mentioned those two practices, I often say, they must be learned together, because they're not as separate as all that. To be deeply aware of somebody will be to be kind to them eventually. Otherwise, the awareness must be something rather robotic, if you see what I mean, which is not true awareness. Yeah. So the individual good, and to use this terminology, the common good, in the context of higher values, are seen absolutely to be the same things. At a lower level, like the political ones say, which I won't go into, you've got dilemmas on your hands, if you see what I mean, between one person's good and another person's. And it seems that sacrifices are needed, or some losses will have to be made, and there's lots and lots of stories about that. But in the context of the Sangha jewel, that won't be true. Sure, yeah.
Hi, it's a quick question.
Sure.
I had a bit of quote. I heard that he said, imagine everyone else around you is enlightened, and that they are acting in the exact right way to help you.
Okay.
I don't know if you've heard that one. Oh. I don't know. What was the question?
And is your question,
It's like-
would I agree?
I suppose, like, do you get why so? I think it's Buddha said it, but do you get why someone would say that? In that you don't really know how enlightened someone else is.
Sure. Okay, so I'll sum up what I've understood so far and have a crack at responding. So you were asking, what I'll try and address is, would it be true and conducive to growth to imagine that everybody around us was enlightened and acting in the best way to conduce to our own enlightenment?
Well, maybe not just to help us.
To help us, okay, yeah, thank you. I haven't heard that attributed to the Buddha, but I can imagine which aspects of the tradition it might be sort of grounded in. Let's see, I'll just go with the second part. There's an emphasis that you sometimes find in the tradition that everybody else is, as it were, a teaching. So however much we like or don't like the behaviour of the people around us, however congenial or difficult we find the people around us, there's something to be learned from it. In one point of view of the Buddhist tradition, it's even a doorway into reality, which actually any of your experience is, but other people will usually be one of the most vivid expressions of what we're calling reality, if you see what I mean. What's known in the tradition as skillful means has sometimes been used to suggest that you could treat everything that happens to you as a teaching. And I think that's what that's based on. So it's saying everything that happens you can make use of, which will be especially rich and true in the case of a Sangha. But I think one's got to be careful to distinguish that from the idea that everything that everybody else does is necessarily the right thing, if you see what I mean. There's some places in the tradition where a helpful method of bending your mind in completely the other direction to its natural tendency is helpful, where that has started to look like doctrine, if you see what I mean. So method and doctrine often need separating. And that method might be needed where we're, let's say, very, very tempted to find fault with other people all the time and imagine that difficult situations are their fault. This is saying, take that on yourself, use it to practice, and assume that you could actually take a deeper and deeper responsibility for growing and growing a situation. So very loosely, I think that's what that's based on. But I think what that kind of brings us back to is that, in a way,
like, you said that you don't have to agree that someone's right.
Mm.
Well, everything's a case-by-case basis.
Yeah.
I don't think you need to sort of judge someone on their words or on their actions. You know, you can see them as the ocean, and their actions and their words are sort of ripples that sort of rise. And then you can sort of try and see them as the ocean instead.
Okay, yeah.
And so in that sense, you can sort of see everyone as being enlightened.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think. Well, there's another teaching. I'm afraid we're very pressed for time, so we'll have to talk more afterwards if that's okay. But there's another teaching called Buddha nature, where we imagine that it's inherent in us to be enlightened already. But without going into that more, as I'm afraid there's not so much time. What I really wanted to point out is that others can reflect a teaching back to us. They can benefit us, even if it's in a way that's not necessarily easy. In a way, that takes us all the way back to the beginning of the session. Gail saying that people reflect us back, yourself saying that we need the support of other people, and even just the enthusiasm and the example of other people we also need. So there's lots and lots of teachings to be found in the people around us. And without going more into those definitions, you could say it's a way of finding the utmost values in our day-to-day life. So if together we try to hold Buddhahood as the ultimate value, and the Dharma as the common shared means of getting there, in our communication with one another, we will be practicing Sangha. Okay, I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave it there. Sorry not to cover all points of view. But do come back next week and hear Jnanavacha talk about the individual development that forms this kind of community that is this eventually very, very exalted value. Okay, thanks for listening. And yeah, if you don't mind. Good. Sorry, I was doing packing up too soon. Let's just put the gear to the sides of the room. See you next week, I hope.
Thank you.
It was wonderful, thank you.
Good, good.
doesn't it?
Well, you might be
Sharing when you're teaching.